When we think of ancient Egypt, our minds immediately go to the dead. We picture the silent stare of the Sphinx, the golden mask of Tutankhamun, and the dusty silence of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. We view Egypt as a giant necropolis, a civilization obsessed with death, magic, and the afterlife. But this view is a mistake. It is a distortion caused by the fact that their stone tombs survived while their mud brick cities crumbled away. In reality, ancient Egypt was the most vibrant, loud, and pulsating place on Earth to be alive. For 3,000 years, a span of time longer than Christianity, Islam, and the modern era combined, this civilization functioned as the world's first true superpower. They didn't just pile rocks into pyramids, they built the engine of civilization itself. They created the first centralized state, the first national bureaucracy, and the first complex medical textbooks. They mapped the stars, invented the 365-day calendar we still use today, and developed a society where women held more legal rights than they would in Britain until the 20th century. But how did this civilization actually work? How did a strip of green land in the middle of a brutal desert become the forge of human history? The answer doesn't lie in the gold of the pharaohs, but in the dark rhythmic waters of a single river. To understand the Egyptian empire, you have to understand that it wasn't a country in the modern sense. It was a machine, and that machine was powered by the Nile. Unlike the unpredictable, violent flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, the Nile was a clockwork miracle. Every year, almost to the day, the river would rise, swollen with monsoon rains from Ethiopia. It would flood the valley, not with destructive force, but with a gentle soak, depositing a layer of rich, black volcanic silt, known as the Kemet, the Black Land. This annual rhythm, known as the inundation, was the heartbeat of the entire economy. It allowed Egyptian farmers to grow a massive surplus of wheat and barley with relatively little effort compared to their neighbors. This surplus was the oil in the gears of the empire. In a world without coined money, grain was the currency. It was the dollar, the euro, and the gold standard all rolled into one. The state collected it as tax, stored it in massive granaries, and redistributed it to pay the army, the priests, and the workers. But this dependence on the river created a fragile paradox. If the Nile rose too high, it destroyed the villages. If it rose too low, it meant famine. This terrifying uncertainty justified the entire political system. The people needed someone to guarantee the flood, someone to maintain the cosmic order. And for that, they looked to one man. The pharaoh was not just a king. In the eyes of his people, he was a biological bridge between the divine and the mortal. His primary job description wasn't just to rule, it was to maintain Ma'at. Ma'at is a concept that is difficult to translate into English. It means truth, balance, order, and justice all at once. It is the opposite of Isfet, or chaos. The ancient Egyptians believed that the universe was naturally chaotic and wanted to crumble back into nothingness. The pharaoh's existence, his rituals, and his administration were the only things holding the sky up and keeping the sun moving. This belief system turned the government into a theology. To rebel against the pharaoh wasn't just treason, it was blasphemy. It was an act of unmaking the world. However, a single man cannot run an empire that stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of Sudan. The real power of the Egyptian state lay in the hands of the scribes. While the pharaoh sat on the throne, the scribes ran the world. Literacy was a guarded technology, a tool of elite power. Only about 1% of the population could read the complex hieroglyphs. This small class of bureaucrats tracked every bushel of grain, every head of cattle, and every stone block. They were the tax collectors, the engineers, and the gatekeepers of the empire. They were the ones who turned the pharaoh's will into reality. If you looked away from the palaces and the temples, you would find the vast majority of the population, the 99%, living a life defined by the soil. The life of an Egyptian farmer was hard, but it was not the life of a slave. Contrary to the biblical movies we watch, the great pyramids and temples were not built by slaves, but by conscripted laborers who were paid for their time. We actually have records of these workers going on strike, arguably the first labor strikes in recorded history, when their rations of grain and beer were late. Daily life for the common person was centered around the river. They lived in homes made of mud brick, which kept the inside cool during the blistering days. On hot nights, entire families would sleep on the flat roofs of their houses to catch the breeze. Their diet was simple: bread, onions, fish from the river, and beer. Egyptian beer was not the clear, fizzy drink we have today. It was a thick, gruel-like soup that was highly nutritious and slightly alcoholic. It was safer to drink than the water and was consumed by everyone, from the pharaoh to the toddler. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of Egyptian society was the status of women. In the ancient world, women were usually treated as property. In Greece and Rome, a woman couldn't own land or testify in court. But in Egypt, women had full legal personhood. They could own businesses, initiate divorce, sign contracts, and even rule the empire as pharaoh, as Hatshepsut and Cleopatra famously did. This level of gender equality wouldn't be seen again in the Mediterranean for thousands of years. The stability of the Egyptian empire allowed them to focus on understanding the world around them, leading to scientific breakthroughs that shaped the course of history. Because the Nile flooded every year and washed away property markers, the Egyptians had to invent a way to remeasure the land accurately. This necessity gave birth to geometry. The Greeks later traveled to Egypt to study this math. Pythagoras spent years in Egyptian temples before developing his famous theorem. But their greatest contribution was arguably in medicine. While the rest of the world was treating illness with drums and dances, Egyptian doctors were conducting surgery. We have a document called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, written around 1600 BC. It is a battlefield trauma manual. It describes how to stitch wounds, how to set broken bones using splints, and it contains the very first written description of the human brain. They realized that the pulse was connected to the heart, a leap in anatomical knowledge that was light years ahead of its time. They also revolutionized the way we measure time. They were the first to determine that a year was 365 days long, based on the solar cycle. They divided the day into 24 hours. Every time you check your watch or look at a calendar, you are using a system designed by Egyptian astronomers 3 millennia ago. Finally, we must return to the dead, but we need to look at it through their eyes. To the Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a dangerous journey. The afterlife was a mirror image of Egypt, a perfect field of reeds where the crops grew tall and the sun always shone. But getting there was expensive. This created a massive industry of death that consumed a huge portion of the economy. Mummification was not magic, it was expensive science. It involved drying the body with natron salts and wrapping it in hundreds of yards of linen. The wealthy bought books of the dead, custom-made cheat sheets containing the spells and passwords needed to trick the gods and pass the final judgment. This obsession was not born out of a fear of death, but out of a love for life. And they loved their world so much that they couldn't bear the thought of it ending. They wanted to take their furniture, their jewelry, their pets, and even their beer with them into eternity. All empires eventually fall, and Egypt was no exception. Eventually, the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans conquered the Nile Valley. The hieroglyphs were forgotten, the temples were buried in sand, and the religion of the pharaohs faded into myth. But the foundation they laid remained. When Rome rose to power, they fed their legions with Egyptian grain. When the Julian calendar was created, it was based on Egyptian astronomy. When Christian monks created the first monasteries, they did so in the Egyptian deserts, using the isolation that priests had used for centuries. The Egyptian Empire was more than just a collection of monuments. It was the laboratory where humanity first learned how to build a state, how to measure the earth, and how to organize a society on a massive scale. We are all, in a way, living in the shadow of the pyramids.